Okay, well, I see we are at the top of the hour, wherever in the world you might be at this moment. And welcome to the International Alliance's webinar on telemedicine best practices in care and research. My name is Colleen Falas, and I'm really thrilled that we are continuing our webinar series with various educational information. I have the honor of being the chair of the International Alliance, and I am based in Washington, D.C. in the United States, and I serve also as the president and CEO of the ALS Association here in the U.S. So first, before we get started, I really want to thank our sponsor of this program, Biogen, who has been a really great supporter of ours, and this helps us bring all of these types of educational information and opportunity forward. So we have an illustrious panel for you today. On your screen, you will see three amazing people. I'm going to have them introduce themselves to you before we get started. So I am just going to go in the order that you all are appearing on my screen here with me. Erin, would you like to kick us off and introduce yourself to our global?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Beneteau. I am a speech language pathologist or therapist, depending on what country you're located in. I'm also a PhD candidate at University of Washington in Seattle in the United States. So I'm the Pacific Coast time person right now. So it's 9 a.m. my time. And last summer, I had the good fortune to work with Microsoft Research in doing research on telehealth and telemedicine and people who use augmentative and alternative communication. So today, I'm really excited to be able to present our findings with you all. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Bruce, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Certainly. I'm Bruce Virgo. I'm Australian, but living in Edinburgh, Scotland for the last 15 years. I was diagnosed with a slow progressing form of MND or ALS in America in 2014 and have since then been involved in numerous MND research projects, mainly around the UK, including the development of the MND Smart platform trial. In 2018, I became an active patient advocate, as well as raising awareness and some fundraising. I joined the Pals and Cows Advisory Council of the Alliance in February last year. Before deterioration of my symptoms forced me to give up work in May 2016, I practiced as an international maritime lawyer based in London.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Glad you could join us today. And last but certainly not least, Chris, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Chris McDermott. I'm a neurologist in Sheffield in the middle of the UK. I'm involved in delivering care to people living with motor neuron disease. I've been developing some telehealth systems and exploring remote monitoring. I have a research program, the focus of which is ensuring that we deliver the best care to those living with motor neuron disease now, ALS now, but also looking at how we can do faster, smarter, less burdensome trials to bring answers quickly about effective therapies for the future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us. You bring really, really interesting and good perspective. So let's go ahead and dig right in. Bruce, I think I'm going to start with you and kind of frame the conversation around what is important and what's the best practice from your perspective, a person living with ALS MND, and what your thoughts are there.
Certainly, Colony. I guess it's important to distinguish the practice or best practice between diagnostic and ongoing care as well as research. Currently, telemedicine or telehealth, as I call it, is not seen as that useful during the diagnostic phase. That's because of the need for observation, assessment, various exclusion tests, and establishing a baseline for ongoing care. That nearly all needs to be done on a face-to-face clinical basis, and most pals understand and accept that. However, for ongoing care, the experiences of pals over the past year, I should explain, pals is a person with ALS or MND, has shown a willing acceptance of telehealth. From online meeting consultations with clinicians and other members of MDTs or multidisciplinary teams, through to just video or telephone calls. Best practice from a PALS perspective would be the use of telehealth wherever possible to restrict the need to attend at clinics or hospitals for matters that could be dealt with virtually or digitally. That includes the potential use of technology to provide vitals such as oxygen sats or lung function. And there has been a recent study up here in Scotland showing that even the assessment of changes to the ALS FRS can be effectively carried out virtually. We recognize research presents a mixed problem, but it's one that needs to be solved. Understandably, data used has to be reliable and acceptable to authorizing bodies. Currently, that rules out a lot of self-reporting or use of, say, popular health apps or novel tech. That said, some clinical trials have adapted over the pandemic to using versions of existing telehealth to avoid or reduce the need for in-clinic visits. A best practice model in research, from our point of view, would be to incorporate telehealth as far as possible in future project or trial design, and that will probably improve over time as technology improves or apps are developed.
That's a really good point. Thank you. And really helpful. I think a lot of people are thinking about how to, now integrate telehealth into all the different aspects of our work. So I want to pivot a little bit to the challenges. We've now kind of really dove in to telehealth, I would say, over this last year and a half plus. and have had a lot more experience and see what those challenges are. So Bruce, I'm going to start with you, but then I'm going to kind of flip over and ask Erin and Chris to jump in as well. So can you think of a particular challenge that you've recognized over this last year as you've been more involved in telehealth?
I could say one of the main challenges for PALS is convincing skeptical health professionals to accept the use of telemedicine. However, seriously, the main issue or challenge for PALS is access to the technology to enable the effective application of telehealth. Now, that may mean anything from having reliable access to the internet through to having the physical ability to make or take phone calls on the one hand, to accessing equipment that best suits the use of telemedicine, from computers through to smartphones on the other. And to underline that, I mean, the UK claims to have advanced infrastructure, and it does. But figures out here this week indicate that 20% of over 64-year-olds and 10% of low-income families don't have internet connection. So that would be, I think, the biggest challenge globally is being able to access.
Yeah, I completely agree. I can tell you here in the United States and at the ALS Association here, it's actually been a huge initiative that we've put forward over this last year, and we always knew it was an issue, but I think the pandemic has exposed that, and I think lawmakers are starting to understand the real needs for that. So Erin, I see you nodding your head. Sounds like you are with Bruce in the, or looks like, I would say that you are with Bruce in some of the challenges he's talking about. So why don't we start with you and see what you've seen as the challenges, and then Chris, I'd love to hear from you if you have extra comments. Erin?
Yeah, I'm 100% with Bruce on the challenges. It's interesting, as I've been writing one of the papers analyzing our results, a lot of related literature before the pandemic that has looked at telehealth highlighted that people who were using telehealth tended to be younger, more affluent people. And then with COVID-19, more and more people have been using telehealth, but there's been an exacerbation of what they refer to as a digital divide, which is exactly what you were describing, Bruce, that people who have access to the internet and to computer technology are able to access telehealth and telemedicine and reap all the benefits from it. But there is a noticeable gap in sort of the haves and the have-nots. And there's a lot of people that either don't have good internet access or don't have the computer technology, or people maybe who have some cognitive challenges in being able to navigate the technology, or English proficiency, or there's a lot of different variables that are highlighting a subset of the wider population that do not have reliable access or can easily access it. And one of the areas of my particular study is we're trying to highlight people who use alternative access for the computer. So using eye control or head mouse, that can interfere with access to telehealth. So one of our findings is a little bit different sort of than the general broad population. People might be very tech savvy and have internet and have computer access, but some of the systems that are being designed for telehealth and telemedicine might not be as compatible with alternative access forms. And so I'm trying to highlight that, hey, when you're designing telehealth systems, you also want to incorporate people who are using alternative access methods in your design and testing of the telehealth system itself.
Thank you. That's really interesting and really helpful. Chris, have you noticed these or other challenges maybe that over the last year that you'd like to jump in on?
So I think I echo what's been said by both Bruce and Erin. In terms of what we found in terms of age range, we've actually found older members of the population of society are happy to engage. I think there's something else going on in a population where the people are adopters of technology that's more than just an age-related thing. And I think we have to explore that and understand it. And we don't have a full understanding of that yet. But there is a real risk that as you develop these services, that you do begin to exclude people unintentionally. And so I think we need to pause, take a sort of step back and understand all the exciting initiatives that have happened to try and make things easier through the pandemic for everything. We need to look what's worked, what hasn't worked. You know, sometimes it's been overwhelming, the amount of technological solutions. I gave this off the cuff remark. It's as if there's been a sort of vomiting up of all sorts of technologies that have just landed on our laps. And because people, companies all over the place have seen an opportunity. And, you know, we need to just think, how is it designed? Were users involved in the design? How do they fit into services? So these are important things that we need to reflect on. One thing that does strike me, though, we're never going to get these technologies that are going to work for everybody. There will be individual person things to do with who they are and their attitudes towards technology, regardless of disease. There will be issues around the disease itself and the way that it affects, you know, some people can never use eye gaze, they never get on with it. So there will always be a place for services, a blended service where there needs to be the traditional model, the face-to-face model. So we shouldn't expect these new technology services, telehealth services, to do everything for everybody. And so if we lower the bar and say, well, perhaps in 70% of the cases, it's going to help, at least in some way for some people, then I think that would be a good thing. But we have to keep the other services going, and we'll have this sort of blended thing. And people might transition through, I think, as Bruce was alluding to, through phases when they can use the technology, but then in other times when it, you know, a more traditional visit or interaction is required. So I think there are great opportunities, but we have to be realistic about what we're expecting of the technology. And the final point, I think, which is beholden upon services, so that the sort of digital divide with regards to finances, you know, and the amount of money people have to pay for these things, that needs to be taken out of the equation. If you have a service and you are bringing technology, then I think the service has the obligation to provide the technology, and that will be easier in some systems. So I think within the UK, the type of social health and social care system we have, that is easier than in other health services. So, but where it is possible, it should be provided.
I think you're spot on. We're all nodding our heads. You know, I know that here in the US and, you know, on our team, we talk all the time about how access isn't just about having a therapy or technology out there. If someone can't get it, or they're in here often we call underinsured, meaning, yeah, if you have enough money to pay for the rest of the product, then you might be able to have it, but otherwise that's not the case. I do like your concept of vomiting technology. I think I've been on 123 different types of Zoom platforms, maybe even just today. So yes, we're all adapting on a regular basis. So I want to kind of explore the pivot that did happen over this last year, and then start to look at what we might see into the future. But let's start first with the pivot. So Chris, since you're on the mic, over the last 12, 16, 18 months, What did you see? You know, we always had a mantra that ALS doesn't stop, so neither can we. So we were always trying to adapt and adjust over this pandemic, and still are, quite honestly. What were some of the key highlights that maybe you all saw?
So when the pandemic really hit, when it started, and we were just being told we can't see people, we can't bring people face to face unless it was a dire emergency, and that was a real challenge. And then on the other hand, you also had patients who knew they were unwell, but didn't want to come in because hospitals were seen, well, getting to the hospital environment was seen as high risk because there were patients with COVID there. So it was when it first hit, it was a real challenge and thinking, well, what are we going to do? And so quickly we were moving on to video platforms. There were a variety, some particularly awful, and then they got better. There was an obsession about encryption and using particular platforms. But so sometimes we just had to pick up the phone and speak to people on the phone. But I think we got more sophisticated as time went on. And I think video consultations and telephone consultations can work for people to touch base, share information in people already diagnosed. And aren't having major, complications. There is a concern of how you monitor respiratory function, nutrition as effectively, over a video or a phone call. But in terms of giving the diagnosis, so I have had to do it over a video, and that was awful. This is something that I won't forget. I think the way that we're trying to do it now, because we're not full up and running back with face-to-face, we're trying to have diagnostic visits where we actually make some physical contact, make that personal connection with somebody during the diagnostic process, perhaps when they're coming for the EMG, taking the history, and then later on doing the sort of going through the results and the diagnosis, doing that through a video, and that has it sort of improved that. But I think it's so important to be in the room when you're talking about someone's future with motor neuron disease, and we're trying to work around those things. But that has been a particular challenge. In terms of, we were doing research on a telehealth platform, or telehealth and motor neuron disease platform, TIM for short, and we'd finished the research and we were about to enter a long user-centered design revision of it. And then the pandemic hit, and we thought, well, we have this, it isn't perfect, and we have all these plans that we want to change it, but why don't we just launch it? So it's been in the university as a research thing. We launched it. We've had a phone call with our information governance team, who they'd had a mind set change through the pandemic. You go to information security people, information governance people, and they have a lot of forms and processes for you to go through, and it's not a very can-do approach usually. This was completely different. They were so keen, they were so supportive, they could see they could make a difference, and they really enabled us to launch it within the NHS systems, our telehealth platform. So that allowed us to start monitoring our patients in a way better than because we were seeing what was going on with patients in sort of real time on a weekly basis. And then we were able to trigger those calls, video calls, or bring people in if we were worried. So the pandemic helped that, because it sort of introduced a can-do approach to information governance, and allowed us to launch a second version of our telehealth platform, which we've been iterating in a more real-world situation now. So we're taking a different approach to how we develop it. But that was one of the pivots that we made.
Thank you. I'm really interesting. I think your highlight of having to give someone a diagnosis over a screen. There are a lot of hard moments over this last year and a half, and certainly those types are really, really, really difficult. I love the idea that, and I think we've seen it all across the globe, that people really leaned in and figured out what we could do, and do it quickly, because we had to. And so I'm hoping that that energy and that sense of urgency continues forward. Bruce, I'd love to hear from you if you have an example of, from your perspective, of a way that either you or your friends that you talk with, I know on a regular basis, made a pivot for your own care. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to just read a couple of statements that were in the Q&A from Gujan, who's in Iceland. And one of the things he said is he said, if he can't use eye gaze, and I think this was from a little bit ago, that he can have someone with him, which is a good concept. And that payment for service, yes, is definitely a work in progress. I think that'll be a huge effort on all of our parts, and the more we work together on that, we're going to be able to accomplish it. And he also said that from his perspective that you can use telemedicine from diagnostics. He said almost all the time, so from a lot of the majority, and it's always what's possible and what we would like, and sometimes we meet somewhere in the middle. So thank you for those comments. Bruce, do you have a thought about how you pivoted, or maybe something that you just heard as a trend from a lot of people living with ALS MND?
I think that I would echo what Chris was saying up here. The pivot from all in-clinic attendances went fairly smoothly after that initial period of hesitation. Like in Sheffield, we've been developing and using a specialized video consultation for MND out of Edinburgh since about 2018, 2019, and it was actually in place just before lockdown, so we were able to implement a changeover fairly swiftly. Diagnostically, I can't comment, but I acknowledge, as I said earlier, the use of telehealth at that stage would be difficult, if not impossible, and certainly not preferable. But for instance, the MND Smart platform trial had actually started here just before lockdown. And because of the fairly smooth change, those who were on the trial were able to continue over lockdown using telehealth, whereas further enrollment was stopped. It meant we didn't lose data or time. For me, contact by text or phone call or the occasional video call, and I only had one trip to the clinic over the last year. The assessments and the checkups were done fairly smoothly, but I'm conscious personally that my progression is such that I possibly didn't have the needs that some of my colleagues who are faster progressing would have. But really, I mean, it's a matter of, as you say, competing with what's possible with what you prefer. And what the pandemic has done, as Chris has described, is changed a lot of attitudes that were maybe instinctively anti-digital or anti-virtual 12 months ago, and we found not just in medicine but other professions and occupations a much greater acceptance and development of, as you say, a vomit of technology, some of which you can keep, the rest maybe you can't. But no, the pivot happened here very smoothly.
Thank you. I think that's great. Sorry, Chris, I think you've come up with a phrase that's going to stick for a while. So speaking of things sticking, you know, we've talked about some things that have been good and some things that have been challenged. And so I'm wondering from your perspectives, what do you think might stick once, you know, I know we're long way to go. We're still coming out of this. And we're hoping we're not going back, right? Everyone is hoping that for sure. But you know, I'm curious as to what, now that we've spent a lot of time talking a little bit and also experiencing this, what do you think is going to stick? So, Erin, do you want to kick us off, and then I'll let it be just a free for all here?
Sure. I think kind of going off of some things that Bruce and Chris have discussed already, I think the fact that telehealth is here and being accepted and accessed by a broader population than before the pandemic is going to stick. I just attended a conference last month called Clinical Informatics Conference. And so that's clinicians who are interested in healthcare technologies and develop healthcare technologies who all come together and talk about the research that they're doing. And telehealth and telemedicine was such a hot topic and very, very commonly discussed. So I think that greater research in that area and greater acceptance of telehealth and telemedicine are definitely sticking. But at the same time, there is a real concern about, especially in the US, are policies going to allow us to continue sticking with telehealth and telemedicine? And that was an active discussion at that conference about trying to get more lobbying efforts so that we can continue to stick with telehealth and have that funded. Because there's a real fear that even though practitioners and patients are both interested in continuing to have telehealth as almost an equal service to in-person, that if that's not funded and billable, that will be a real issue.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. It's a super hot topic here in Washington. I was just having a conversation yesterday with a congresswoman who seemed pretty, I would say, positive and hoping that that's going to happen. But I know we are not the only community that is really focused on making sure that these benefits go forward in a way that we're all trying to embrace them. So Chris or Bruce, do you have anything else to add about stickiness?
I can say, I think it will stick. I completely agree with Erin, and there are challenges ahead. I suppose we've started to use it, and now we have to prove to, you know, commissioners and the people that pay that it is of merit. And right. So I think there's often a focus about, well, you know, this will save money, this will save time. No, I don't think that's true. I don't think it saves any time. I don't think it saves any money. I think there may even be a cost pressure at times with some of this. But what I am sure about, but need to evidence this, and that's where it's good to hear all this research that's going on, is that it enhances quality and ensures, you know, that the care that delivered is of a higher quality, and you know, that patients are feeling more supported, that they have a better quality of life. In terms of clinical trials, the protocols are changing. So the MD Smart trial has altered its protocols. I'm involved in research where we've completely rewritten, you know, our protocols. So we're doing some of them which are now completely delivered remotely. So a psychological intervention we're delivering remotely, from consenting, recruiting, delivering the intervention. And I'm seeing various protocols coming through now from industry, and they all are thinking about patient burden much more. So I think that the spin-off of this will be the pandemic, that we will use technology, we'll use it in clinical trials and clinical care. But we just need to, as I said before, take a step back and what is the best way?
Great, thank you.
I would just add that from a PALS perspective, we would hope that all the changes will stick. We're very much in favor of continued and increased use of telehealth in care, and hopefully in time and research as well. Pardon me.
Okay,
I've used most of my voice already.
it's okay. Take your time.
The thing is not to replace face-to-face, is to complement it. And as Chris has rightly said, relieve the burden on the patient, because there's an awful lot of effort and anxiety involved in leaving your home to go to a clinic or a hospital. And if that can be reduced, that improves our quality of life.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I see everyone nodding their heads, really not replacing, but more of an enhancement, right?
Yeah.
And I see that a lot. So kind of going along that same piece, we talked about the digital divide and kind of the unintended consequences of exclusion. Aaron and Chris, I'm curious from your perspectives and just your interactions, do you think in some ways it's actually expanded access for some? Have you seen, or have you been communicating or meeting people that maybe you wouldn't have before? And I know I have in different ways, but I'm not a physician and I'm not, a PT or an OT. It's a little bit different from my seat. So I'm curious from yours what you're seeing. Chris, maybe you want to bite that one off first?
Yes. So I think, there are people who travel to our center from some distance, 200-mile round trips and greater, and they might come once for a sort of second opinion regarding what's going on, of some advice. We're able to keep in contact with them more through the course of their illness, and have done more than so even though the pandemic has hit, I've had more contact with them and been able to offer advice and support on an ongoing basis, because the distance is irrelevant if you have the systems to communicate. So yeah, I think it has with all the caveats about the being wary about excluding people. I think there are a large section of people living with motor neuron disease who we are able to have more contact with through these technologies.
Great. Aaron, what do you think?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I'm a huge proponent of that. Telehealth has expanded access to care. I just was looking up, so one of the references that I'm citing in my work is a study that was done before the pandemic, looking at over 1 million patient visits between 2016 and 2018. And this is just patients in general, not specific to MND, but 86% of those were scheduled as office visits, and only 14% of telemedicine visits. And of those 14%, 7% were video. And the research is still coming out because the pandemic is still so new. People are just starting to document now, but I would guess that those numbers have shifted significantly since COVID-19, that more people are doing telehealth and telemedicine visits, and that more people are getting those visits more quickly and are scheduling them more. There is one piece of research that just came out that was looking at a subset of a population, saying that they were analyzing time from scheduling to actually having the visit. And that particular population, people were able to schedule their office visits via video conference more quickly than if they had been in person. And then also, I think, to Bruce's point too about the anxiety and exhaustion of having to travel and going to a clinic, that really came through with my own research. Both clinicians who I interviewed, as well as people who use AAC and have MND, talked about that they were more willing to schedule visits if they were telemedicine or telehealth visits instead of having to travel. And in large part, that was fatigue. One clinic actually said that they'd seen an increase in patients from more remote areas scheduling patient visits, because it was just so much easier for them and less fatiguing for them to be able to have those visits than having to travel all the way into the clinic. There is that caveat, though, that two clinicians I interviewed especially kept stressing that they were very concerned that there are people who are not getting essential care services that they need because of those barriers we discussed to telehealth. But overall, I'm very positive about it. I think it has expanded access to care.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious to see how your research plays out as this goes on. I can tell from our perspective, maybe from an advocacy organization, that we saw a tremendous increase in participation in support groups. It was kind of the same thing, right? People having to traditionally travel into, whether it was a local church or community center or wherever it was, and maybe couldn't do it that day. And so we started to see a real uptick, and even people joining support groups, different states and different places. And I certainly have experienced, from the international perspective, I feel like I know a whole lot more people now than I used to, because we're doing so much more of this, and certainly enriching the education and conversation that we're having. So I'm really curious. Keep me updated, Erin, on your research as that plays out. So we talked about some of the unintended consequences. I think we often think of those as negative, but sometimes there are some positive ones. And I mean, yeah, COVID has certainly brought us some, we know a lot of negative, but has certainly brought us some positive unintended consequences and things that we have discovered. And Chris, I'm kind of curious from your perspective on new discoveries. Were there things that have kind of bubbled up over the last year and a half that maybe we wouldn't have thought of before?
So I don't know if it's new or I think we were thinking about it, but we just, so I'm going to talk about carer and carer sort of impact of caring for someone with motor neuron disease. So within the system that we've been developing, the carer has an account as well, and so the carer is able to things about their own sort of mood, how they're feeling. So they fill in questionnaires on our system, and we were seeing, and we have seen, quite a large mental health burden within caring for someone with motor neuron disease. And I don't think that's particularly news, and one would expect it. But I think if you think about the traditional face-to-face clinic, and certainly in our service, one of the deficiencies is perhaps it's focused around the individual with motor neuron disease. It's about working, to maximize their quality of life, their function in that MDT. When they come, all the focus is on there. Everyone's, is trying to be positive and be solution focused. And I think that's also the carer's role often in those MDT meetings is, they're very much part of the MDT and also being solution focused and everything. And we don't often have, I mean, they're so busy. When people come, time is precious, and there isn't a focus. And even if you did make a focus on the carer, I think the carer would not want to say anything. I'm really struggling. What about me? That's not going to happen. What we found in the people sitting in a room by themselves, filling in their questionnaire, we're picking up in a third to a half, people scoring high on anxiety, high on depression. So when we've been seeing that, we've been ringing up the carers who are surprised that someone is taking an interest in them. We're very, very, very grateful that this interest has been shown. So they're not our patients though, so that there's a challenge there. So it's signposting them to their GP, the support services, or just having an informal talk. And often that informal talk really helps. And we've had feedback afterwards saying, I really appreciated the call, just being able to talk about it. You know, you told me it's all right to feel like this. And then we've seen improvement in their mental health. And it's just made me step back and think about, you know, what we perhaps were missing a little bit in the way our clinics were set up in the face-to-face. And I still think if we went to full face-to-face, it would be really difficult to really explore this issue. And so in this way, I think telehealth is very good for exploring this sort of sensitive side of carer impact and supporting the carer to support the individual with motor neuron disease.
Yeah, that is so critical. And so I think certainly one of the opportunities that we're seeing here, and what I mean by that is, I think the world experienced what it was like a bit more to if you, whether even you just had kids at home that you had to make sure we're getting educated while you're taking care of this and taking care of that. And you know, I hope we can actually bring that in front of our various legislative bodies to see if we can get more support. And, you know, and I just wanted to add, because as you were talking, Chris, I was thinking of this very recent conversation I had around isolation. And the world, I believe, has now, this is a moment in time to strike while the iron is hot, where people are like, oh, being isolated is really terrible. And it's really hard on people's mental health, whether you're a person living with ALS or you're not. And really, how do we try to engage in making sure that people aren't isolated, whether they're a carer or whether the person living with ALS MND. So I'm trying to be a half glass full and see things as opportunities for change as we realize some discoveries, like you said, that maybe we were just missing or weren't necessarily as focused on. Erin, do you have anything to add, or Bruce?
I definitely want to commend Chris, because Chris, the work you're doing about carers is certainly a gap in my current research. I'm mostly focused on technology and the possibly even potentially contributing to the vomiting of more technology, or at least the analysis of the vomit. But the care aspect, I think, is so important. And I'm so grateful that you are addressing that, because just in the general literature, there's not a ton of work around that area regarding telehealth right now. And that clinical informatics conference that I mentioned, I'd actually done a sort of a preview of my research at a smaller workshop earlier. And there was a big discussion about caregivers. And to the Q&A point earlier, you can have caregivers access the telehealth platforms for someone who maybe isn't able to use it with eye control or head mouse or something like that. But is that always appropriate? Some of the people that I interviewed had said no, they were the most tech savvy person in their household. Their carers were not, and it just added extra stress and extra burden to them. A clinician shared with me how someone had to actually pay someone to be able to access their records because they weren't able to, and so then that was a breach of privacy, really. And so there's a lot more work, I think, that can be done around carers. And I also just want to throw out one of the other, like the glass half full, one of the other opportunities that I think is really interesting that Bruce, you've mentioned as well, is this idea of sensor technology to supplement telehealth and telemedicine. And that has been on sort of the research radar in the clinical informatics community about how home sensors, like even Fitbits or Apple Watches or blood pressure cuffs at home, could supplement. But at least in the US, that's been highly controversial because a lot of clinicians think, well, that's not being done in a standardized way, so we won't know how accurate those measurements are. But there's sort of been this rebirth of interest into looking at that and maybe how that can at least supplement and provide some more information, maybe for diagnostics or maybe just for ongoing care. And so I think that's really exciting that there's some more interest into looking into that aspect. And one of my collaborators actually mentioned the idea of having that for carers as well, being able to remotely monitor carers' health as in addition to the person with MND as well, which I thought was really interesting. And I can't take credit for that idea. That was one of my collaborators.
Great, thank you both. All right, well, this has been great. Now I want to kind of turn to a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you would like any of our panelists to answer, please go ahead and put those into the chat. I'll give people a couple of minutes. And Kathy, you can always text me if something comes that I don't see. So but first, one thing that we haven't quite hit on yet is research and the impact that the pandemic has had on research and kind of developing research initiatives and how that might continue despite what is happening within the pandemic. So I'm curious about your thoughts. I know Bruce earlier you mentioned a little bit about clinical trial design, I think was where you were going with it. And I know there was some conversation around some of the platform studies and how they were rolling out. So I'm curious as to, again, kind of the impact that we saw, and then also maybe the stickiness going forward on some of the design. So does anyone want to jump in on that?
Only from obviously an observation point of view, but one of the benefits perceived has been the increased opportunity for researchers to collaborate and share data and findings over larger distances and in faster time periods without the need and expense of a physical presence. I would like to think that this will be a catalyst for increased advances. And the other thing which we all touched on and Aaron did in some detail is the innovation and development of new tech, such as validated wearables or sensors, which can provide reliable and acceptable data remotely. I would like to think we will see major advances in that over the next year or two. Sorry, my voice is used pretty much today's quota of words.
Yes, it's all right. They've been good, powerful words, so thank you. Yeah, I think you're spot on. It looks like everyone else agrees. And all I can sit here and think is, I think it's more important than ever now that people with ALS and MND are involved in some of the clinical trial designs as our research goes forward, given some of the things you just shared with us, Bruce. Anyone else have anything to add to that around research?
I'll just add, oh, sorry, Chris.
No, Erin, ladies first.
Thank you. I'll just add one thing that has has occurred to me as we've all been talking that I don't think is really documented yet. We've discussed about the digital divide for telehealth technologies, but as Chris alluded to, we had to completely change our research protocols, which in many ways opened up participation to a wider audience because it was virtual. So I was able to have more of a global audience for all of my research going forward. But there's also that limitation of people who don't have access to technology then are somewhat naturally being excluded. And I'm not sure that as a research community, we've discussed that as openly as we've been noticing, like the digital divide with telehealth, but we haven't necessarily been talking about how that's also going to be affecting all research that's occurred in 2019, 2020, and 2021 as well. And I almost wonder if that will need to be noted in limitations going forward.
Excellent point. Excellent. Yeah.
I think that's I think that's a really interesting point. And I think when we're describing results from clinical trials in the year going forward, I think it's more important. So it will be more important to discuss what the recruitment strategy was, what the inclusive strategy was. So as you say, if you're researching technology and you do it just using online platforms, you're getting a particular type of individual who has self-selected through their ability to use the technology, and you're not learning anything from outside. So it's important that that's upfront in the description. But similarly, so I'm just thinking about the trials that we've been doing. You know, we have gone remote because we couldn't see people face to face, say in the Commend study. But now that things are loosening, I think it's important that you continue to just like the blended approach with care, there needs to be a blended approach with clinical trials. So the opportunity for participation in clinical trials must be for all. And so I think the technologies allow us to people at distance reduce the burden, but if people want to be involved and want to do the face-to-face visits, we should support them to do that still, but make the face-to-face visits less burdensome as well. You know, I see some trial protocols and they've never been looked at by a patient because a patient would never have signed them off. You know, and you know, a 6-hour visit in a trial center having X, Y, Z, ABC done, and we need to stop having trial protocols like that. And as Bruce said earlier, patients need to be involved in the design of clinical trials.
Yeah, 100%.
Certainly, that was the experience here. I mean, we had a patient and carer participation group involved in the trial design and development of the scientific aspect, but the patient aspect for 2 years before the M&D SMART trial was finalized and launched. And that input about inclusivity, methods of delivery of the drug or drugs were all considered in a collaborative sense by patients, MDTs, and researchers. And it worked well.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, like I said, I think now more than ever, we're going to have to really make sure that people are at the table when these trials are designed. So I've gotten a couple of other, well, I'm not even sure it's a question, maybe more of a statement, and I know we're almost at the top of the hour. So I'm just going to read this. It says, can stickiness only happen country by country because it's funded locally? And I guess the answer is yes. I don't know if anyone has a different answer. Yeah, I think you know it is funded locally, but maybe there are global efforts that we can have to move in that direction. But You know, I know Aaron and I are, you know, from the United States, and we're pretty focused on how we do that here in the U.S. But anyone else have a quick answer that they'd like to give to that stickiness?
I think so. Globally, we have to show the benefits. You know, without doubt, this is the value of doing things this way, and then then you can begin to have a conversation with commissioners and payers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll just leave us with two statements that Gujan put into the chat. First, he's very supportive of monitoring the health of carers and the helpers. And I see that a lot from other people I think many of us interact with. And he also just mentioned, you know, that technology might be exclusive, but we're excluding some people today by not supporting the persons that attend. So I think there's always that concern about making sure, again, that act right. And kind of that blended opportunity as you have all have mentioned. So we are at the top of the hour. This has been a really great discussion. Chris, Aaron, thank you so much for spending either your morning, your afternoon, or your evening with us. And for those who joined us live, great to see you again. And for those who are seeing us in a recording, thanks for joining us after. And Angelique just said thank you all. So I will leave it with that. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day and evening, and look forward to another webinar soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.